Hey everyone, I'm Hashem, welcome back to Pushing Film. This is my intermediate level instructional video on measuring light by eye and using the Sunny 16 system. It's a follow-up to a previous video entitled Tips for Metering Without a Light Meter, where I asked if viewers would be interested in a more advanced breakdown and had quite a few requests for it. So here we are. This will be a slower paced, short course of sorts, consisting of 3 main lessons with the 3rd lesson including some practical breakdowns. I highly recommend watching the other video first, ideally, or even after this one, since I consider the tips there to be an integral part of my methodology for effectively gaining proficiency in this system. I'm bringing you this video free of charge here on YouTube, thanks to our sponsor, Pixspot. So if you get something out of this video, please check them out, or other ways you can support the channel using the links in the video description. Some quick housekeeping before I get started. This method is most suitable for manual film cameras with full control of shutter speed and with a manual aperture ring, but it could be employed with other camera types too. Also, shutter speed works in fractions of a second, but for the purpose of this video and for the sake of ease, I'll refer to faster shutter speeds as higher numbers, even though they are technically smaller numbers as you get faster. But it's just easier while learning to think about the second part of the fraction and consider faster shutter speeds as higher numbers, or as moving up, as they're often represented on shutter speed dials. And lastly, many sections of the video might benefit from hitting the pause button to catch some of the information on screen, including the notes and diagrams that I might put up. With all that said, let's get to it. Okay, so lesson 1 in the video is finding your baseline exposure that you can then work off for everything else. And the way you want to do that, especially when you're first starting off and practicing, is to just use a light meter and then get used to that. And then eventually we want to be able to move to using the Sunny 16 table. And better yet, you want to be able to memorize the Sunny 16 table and not have to pull it out on your phone or a piece of paper or whatever and refer to it, which is the ultimate aim of being able to meter using your eyes, using your mind. So the way you want to figure out your Sunny 16 baseline using the table, and I'll try and put one up on the screen now as a reference, is by remembering the name, which is Sunny 16. And that's like the anchor, the point that helps you remember the rest. So basically using that anchor, using the Sunny 16 rule, it means that if you're shooting in a sunny situation, so not necessarily just a sunny day, but a sunny scene, then you would use f16. What about the shutter speed? So that depends on the ISO of film you're using, and the way you figure out the shutter speed is based on the ISO of the film. If it's ISO 400, you would use 1/400th of a second shutter speed. Now, if your camera doesn't have 1/400th of a second, you just choose the nearest one. So that would be 1/500th of a second. So another example of that is I have Portra 160 loaded in this camera at the moment, and if it's sunny, I'm going to use f16, and the ISO is 160. So I'll choose 160th of a second shutter speed. This particular camera doesn't have that. Maybe some electronic ones do, but the closest speed on this is 125th. So I would choose that, and that would be my baseline. And the same thing goes again, ISO 100 film, you would choose 1/100th of a second shutter speed. And if your camera doesn't have that exact speed, just choose the nearest one. Now, one point on that is you can go either to 1/125th of a second, or you can actually go to 1/60th of a second, which is the next closest, but either way, you'll be fine. It won't really matter too much. For myself, because I actually shoot negative film 95% of the time, negative film likes overexposure. So I would actually go with the lower number, but just to make things easy for yourself, choose the closest number and worry about those minute details later. All right, so if sunny equals 16 is how we start with the table, our anchor point, what if it's not sunny? You just work up or down that table. So with any typical table, it usually means that sunny equals 16, partly cloudy would be F11, cloudy would be F8, overcast or very cloudy, where there's not even any shadows, would be F5.6, and something like sunset would be F4. So again, you work up or down the table. From F16, the only situation you would work up from is if it's extremely bright, like sand or snow, something that reflects a lot of light. So that would be F22. But generally, you're going to be working down from 16. So with time, interpreting one of those tables will just become easier and easier. Even if it's a little bit confusing right now, stick with it. It's not too bad. And that's how you figure out your baseline in the easiest way possible. So once you've figured out that baseline, you can go ahead and use those settings. So the next part you can start to ask yourself as you get used to this system is to ask yourself, how do these settings suit my scene creatively speaking? Do I prefer to have a shallower depth of field. Maybe I don't need f16 even though it's full on sunny. Maybe I'd prefer to have a lower f-stop to blur out the background like what you have with me right now. Maybe I'm trying to freeze some action like a flying bird. So 125th of a second wouldn't be fast enough. That's where we get into lesson 2. Okay, so lesson 2 is where you want to start to exercise some flexibility beyond that baseline. Once you've learned how to figure out the baseline for a scene, let's say those settings, they might work, but you would prefer to use something different, creatively speaking, for creative reasons. Then we use what's called reciprocity. And in my video, I'm going to call it equivalent exchange. I just think it's a more interesting and fun way to remember it, because it's something that came out of one of my favorite animes of all time, which is Full Metal Alchemist, where they call it the law of equivalent exchange. And in this application, it means that for every f-stop you want to go down, you have to go up in shutter speed. So the higher the f-stop number you're going to choose on your lens, the lower the shutter speed you're going to choose on the shutter speed dial, and so on. So exchanging shutter speed for aperture, meaning you equally have to exchange one for the other, up and down as many stops as you want.
人は何かの犠牲なしに何も得ることはできない。何かを得るためには同等の代価が必要になる。それが錬金術における等価交換の原則だ。
So we actually kind of got a preview of this already when we were figuring out what shutter speed to use based on the ISO, because there's a reciprocity there. It's all equivalent exchange. It kind of ends up being like an exposure triangle. So what you'd want to do is, if your baseline was, say, it's completely sunny right now, I'm in full sunlight, and you're at f16 and 250th of a second on some 200 speed film, but you don't want to use f16. You'd rather blur out the background a little bit. You're taking a portrait. So you want to be able to reduce that aperture number. So for each stop you go down in aperture, so for each full number on the lens, you want to be able to increase the shutter speed by one full number. Now this doesn't count half clicks and micro adjustments on some electronic cameras, but again, use the table. You can kind of work your way up and down the table.
What I mean by this is working up and down the full range of aperture and shutter speeds available to your camera, i.e. filling in the gaps on a basic Sunny 16 chart to create a table in your mind. I don't like maths personally, so I won't focus much on this table paradigm, but suggest that you focus on the more intuitive approach of equivalent exchange, which works perfectly well for manual film cameras that have full stops of control on the shutter speed dial and aperture. This approach will work well to start you off and indefinitely afterwards. And if you are mathematically inclined, you can start to build tables in your mind according to the ISO films that you commonly shoot. Let's quickly recap what we've learned so far in both lessons and find out how you can progress further from this point onwards.
Right now is seeing as it's getting quite late and the sun just is about setting behind me. We are now at the lower end of the table where I would use f4 with whatever my reciprocal shutter speed is for ISO. So again, I have Portrait 160 in here. I'm going to go with 125th because it's the closest thing to 160 on my shutter speed dial. And if I was taking a photo of the sunset scene behind me, I'd be best off using f4. So I'm going to look through the light meter of this AE1 and see how that matches up. And honestly, that's about bang on. But if I point up at the brighter part of the sky, it's going to have a brighter reading. And if I point down to the lower half of the scene, it's going to require more light. So that is what gets us into one of the later lessons, which is about getting granular. But for the overall average metering, you can really trust the Sunny 16 system by figuring out your baseline and then working up and down the table from there using the concept of reciprocity or equivalent exchange.
Before we continue the lesson, I'd just like to mention the sponsor of this video. Pixpy is the service that I have been using for years for my website, blog, online store, and for delivering photo galleries to clients or friends. I had tried other website services before, but eventually settled with Pixpy because I found them to offer the best value for money and to be one of the most suitable for photographers and creatives. In fact, I was the one to originally reach out to them to sponsor the channel. And honestly, I think that a lot of you guys watching might like them as well if you're thinking of building your own photography site or comparing their value to whatever you're currently using. They have heaps of great templates, an easy to use builder, features for blogs, SEO, online shops, mobile apps, and of course, photo galleries. Customer service is also amongst the top rated, which is nice if you get stuck. If you want to give them a free 15-day trial, check out the link in the description, and if you choose to sign up, you can use my promo code for 50% off your first annual plan. Now let's continue with lesson 3 with some practical examples and scene breakdowns, implementing what we've learned so far in lesson 1 and 2 while getting granular and looking at specific portions of some scenes out on the streets.
All right, so lesson 3 is about getting granular, meaning breaking down the scene and not just looking at it as a whole. So using that system of lesson 1 and 2, you can figure out a good average exposure for a scene. But what if you have a scene with very mixed segments? So you got this bright sky up here and you got the darker segment of grass. And then you want to start to get granular and figure out which part of the scene do I want to prioritize. Because again, it's not just about whether it's sunny or cloudy, but it's about what are you pointing your camera at? Am I focusing on the shade below this tree, or am I focusing more on the bright sky that's happening? So basically, what do I want to meter for? And with the B-roll, I'm showing you, I'm pointing at different parts underneath the tree and then up at the sky, and you can see how wildly the metering will change. So you have to take that into account as you get better at using Sunny 16 metering. You can start to break scenes down and get granular.
And the best way to do that is to utilize everything we've learned so far, as well as the tips from my previous video. So use a light meter, get out there and practice and examine and break down scenes. You might have this area which looks more sunny, so f16, but then this sort of semi-open shade will be between 5.6 or f4. And you'll probably learn that you'll only ever be a little bit off or spot on most of the time. Keep repeating this process of guessing and checking, give it some time, and eventually you'll become proficient at exposing for particular parts of a scene without using a light meter.
To continue this lesson, I'm going to head back inside because it's getting a bit dark here, and we're going to take this out onto the street and use it in practice to help you understand how I would use this when shooting street photography, for example.
And remember not to get too hung up on perfection or perfect exposure, because that is a flexible concept anyway. Sunny 16 or metering by eye is about flexibility, detaching yourself from machine calculated measurements and learning to use your eyes, experience, and intuition, letting it all become an organic and enjoyable part of the process, like changing gears on a bike. In this first scene breakdown, we have a very sunny late morning in Sydney. And the particular part of the scene that I was wishing to expose for was the lady and the other people who are standing in direct sunlight. You can tell that it's completely sunny because the shadows are hard-edged, and because I'm also trying to expose for the sunny part of the scene, this is a situation where I could use the baseline of f16, and let's say I was on 400 speed film, I could use 1/500th of a second, and then maybe even step up to 1/1000th of a second with f11, just to make sure I get everything tack sharp in case she moves. So I've used equivalent exchange of one stop from my baseline. And in the final exposure, you can tell that I've metered for the bright or highlight parts of the scene because the remainder, the shadows, still look dark. In the next breakdown, it's a fairly sunny afternoon in Melbourne, but it's actually partly cloudy and you can see a little bit of a soft edge to the shadows. The other thing is that for this scene, I didn't want to have as high a contrast as the previous scene and expose exclusively for the highlights. I wanted to get a bit of light into those shadows and have a little bit more brightness in the scene overall. So this is a situation where I would use the partly cloudy part of the table as my baseline and then maybe even round down on my shutter speed. So I was using Pro Image 100 rather than 1/100th of a second. I might have gone down to 1/60th of a second with f11. And then because 1/60th is a little bit slow for the fact that these kids are moving around, I can equivalent exchange 2 stops up. So let's say 1/250th of a second, and instead of f11, go down to f5.6, which will give me plenty of depth of field considering how far away the subject is. All right, the next scene breakdown is a tricky one because it's the middle of the day and cloudless. It's technically sunny, however, this is a very hazy scene that I'm dealing with. So you can look at the shadows and use them as a guideline. The shadows in this hazy scene actually look more like the shadows that would occur on a cloudy day. So not just partly cloudy, but around normal cloudy. So using the Sunny 16 table, that's the f8 part of the table. So with 1/500th of a second on the shutter speed and f8, I actually just went with baseline, stuck with that. That was plenty of shutter speed and aperture to freeze subjects, and it's what I ended up going with. Of course, I could use equivalent exchange for this scene if I wanted to, but that's just a straightforward example of how, even though it looks sunny, it's actually hazy. Look at the shadows, which is a great tip for helping you judge the light without actually using or relying on a light meter. So the same would apply in a non-hazy, cloudy situation, especially as the sun gets lower in the sky and you get these longer shadows. This might be another situation where I could use f8 as the baseline setting. Now in this set of examples, we're entering into situations that I would consider to be overcast, so down on the f5.6 part of the Sunny 16 table. So that would be my baseline. And of course, depending on the film I'm using, I can determine my shutter speed. and then work up or down from there. Keeping in mind that light's getting pretty low for most films now, so I might need to open up the aperture to a smaller number on the lens. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind when working in these more overcast situations is that your eyes will have adjusted and it may not actually seem that dark, but the lack of shadows is one good giveaway. And something that's worth keeping in consideration is that if you're surrounded by tall buildings in a fairly big and gloomy, oftentimes gloomy city like Melbourne, you might need to round down even more, meaning that baseline isn't quite good enough. This is something worth considering whenever you're using Sunny 16. So even though my baseline might be the overcast part of the table, sometimes you might have a subject like the one that I've shown in a previous vlog that I'm approaching now, up against a building where there's extra shadow, there's a bit of an alcove where there's a lack of light. So I might be using an extra stop of light just for that reason. So this is something that isn't so perceivable at first because you don't have those heavy shadows indicating that someone or something is in shade, but then just look around and examine the ambient light and keep this in consideration whenever you're using Sunny 16 because our eyes can be easily tricked. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, always lean towards overexposure if you can when using negative film. Alright, so I'll leave you now with a couple more scene breakdowns showing what baseline I might have guessed using the Sunny 16 rule, everything we've learned so far, but also a freeze frame where you can kind of look at the overall scene but break it down further and get granular and think about which part of the scene you're going to expose for and take this method and employ it into your own practice when learning to meter by eye. Now I could keep showing you more examples in sunset, shades, snow and so forth, but I think you get the point by now. Also, the best way to learn is to go out and practice for yourself in your own shooting situations. A light meter will be your best friend when starting off and is something you should still keep and check against as you advance. I highly recommend a handheld incident meter like this one because it allows you to angle and position it to simulate the surface that you'll be photographing. On-camera reflective meters are harder to learn and understand light with because they measure for larger parts of a scene and can be easily thrown off by areas that you aren't necessarily exposing for. If you have a very center-weighted meter in your camera, that would be preferable, and better yet, if you have a spot metering mode, then that would be even better. If you can't afford or justify a dedicated meter like this one, try using one of the many light metering apps for smartphones which are often free and should be accurate enough in most situations. However, a good quality handheld meter will be the most accurate option when learning to read light by yourself, especially when you get into the far ends like low light, indoor, and other tricky lighting situations. This Sekonic L308 is the one I recommend. It's a great middle ground between the really expensive options and the little cheaper hot shoe mounted ones that do reflective metering. I'll put an affiliate link to the latest version of this on Amazon in case you're interested in getting one, but of course, feel free to find and use whatever suits you best. I'll leave you with that and say that I hope this was helpful for you. Please let me know in the comments if it was, and if you'd like to see another sequel on advanced techniques for metering by eye where we can go further into even more detailed scene breakdowns and methods that I use while out in dynamic situations on the streets. Thank you for watching, and again to Pixpa for sponsoring this video. Enjoy shooting, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode here on the channel.